it's a pleasure now to do it in person, because I've done a few online talks to the center, and to have the opportunity to share my most recent research work, still ongoing. I haven't finished this piece of research yet, so I'm trying out some ideas as I speak. I also thank for those who are watching online, whom I won't have the pleasure to meet in person. I will prioritize, as I address the camera and the people that are really here around the table. So I apologize that sometimes I'm just looking like this at the screen. Anyway, this is the topic of our conversation today. It's part of a book that I'm writing on populism, conservatism, and religion in Brazil. Basically, a reflection on the last 10, 15 years of Brazilian politics, which is very much a period in which religion played a very high profile. And when I say religion, I may be overgeneralizing, because the most distinctive aspect of this engagement of religion and politics over the last 15 years has a lot to do with conservative evangelical politics. But as you will see as we go through the slides, it's not something that is so clear-cut. So to say conservative evangelical politics doesn't necessarily mean a package which comes with a single set of practices and ideas and so on. So I would like to, the arrow is not moving here. Which one? Okay, right. So let me just show you for a start a few pictures which show different dimensions of this engagement of evangelicals. And when I say evangelicals, it's also again a not such a straightforward word. Evangelical in English has to do with a particular movement within the Protestant fold. And evangelical in Brazil is the word that addresses any Protestant from any denomination. A real dispute had to be put in place for evangelical, in Portuguese, evangélico, to come to mean something specific, definite, something people would say is about the whole of a community, which we could hardly expect it to be, but in a way it's part of the story. How evangelicals became the evangelicals who designate or nominate a whole community, or at least there's the intent that through this word or this expression, a whole community would be represented. Well, anyway, we can start with the lower picture on the left of the screen, when we have a rally where people are between praising God and listening to evangelical speakers who are also politicians, telling them what next for Brazilian society and what evangelicals had to do to be truthful to their commitments of faith. There's an element of nationalism involved here, which is very recent as far as evangelical politics is concerned in the Brazilian case. The flags, Brazilian flags represent that. And you also see that it's a street demonstration. I mean, it's a public rally. It's not something that's taking place inside a church. It's not something that is taking place among the few, but it is something drawing hundreds, thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of people together into the public space to stand for something or call for something. The picture on top, the top left picture, is a picture of recently elected President Bolsonaro in 2018, this may have been early 2019, being blessed by Bishop Macedo, who's the founder of the Universal Church of the Kingdom of God, a massive neo-Pentecostal church that is today operating in over 80 countries in the world, and is the second largest Pentecostal church in Brazil, having been founded in 1977, whereas the largest Pentecostal church in Brazil goes back to 1910. And to give you some sense of proportion here, the Assemblies of God, they will have a number about 40 million followers today, whereas the Universal Church will have something between 2 and 3 million. And it's still the second largest Pentecostal church. And probably the second largest evangelical church in Brazil. Well, so the president has been blessed by a Protestant minister or a Pentecostal minister who 40 years ago would be an absolutely unthinkable thing to see or to be able to attend. And this is taking place within a church. So the president has been invited. This is a service, a regular service of the church. And Bishop Macedo has come all the way from the US because he doesn't live in Brazil any longer. He lives in the US, has lived in the US for many years now. But he was there to do some kind of a Te Deum as regards this newly elected president, whom he had only come to support a few months earlier. Until then, he was part of the coalition that had brought Lula into power in 2003, all the way to 2016. Anyway, on the right, you have the bigger picture, which is Lula's inauguration just over a month ago, 2023. And the red circle there allows us at least to see an open Bible, which is being held up and out by a Pentecostal pastor who is also a policeman in Bahia, Brazil, a Black person who is holding this Bible as he also holds a Brazilian and an Israel flag on the other side of his shoulder. So, and he is a supporter of Lula. He had been in the opposition during Bolsonaro's years, but he became estranged with Bolsonaro's politics to a point that he came back to the support of Lula. He had been part of Lula's coalition before 2016. So you see that things keep changing here, and it's not a clear-cut kind of right-left divide that we have. So we may need some clarification here of the topic. I would like to start with the 1980s in Brazil and the deep changes that the democratization process brought into the country's social, cultural, and political ways. Democratization, just to, well, if you don't know, between 1964 and 1985, Brazil was under a military dictatorship, which was also a military and civilian alliance. For a number of reasons and through a number of processes, from the late 1970s, it became more and more difficult for the military to remain in power. And many different forms of demands for freedom, for better life conditions, for participation, for visibility, recognition, acceptance, being part of decision-making and so on, started to spring up in the Brazilian context after 20 years of very limited, very narrow spaces and including repressive moments in which people could not take to the streets without being physically assaulted by the police or imprisoned, tortured, and so on. Well, this is something which picks up momentum from the late 70s, and by 1985, we have the end of these 20 years of military rule and the first civilian government in the country after that time. And this whole process allowed for a number of social demands and social actors to emerge publicly, which were until then basically invisible. And that's, I think is the square one of this story that I am trying to tell you today. This whole process is also coupled with religious change and a new politics of culture developing in the country. On the religious front, we moved from a time when, even during the dictatorship years, liberation theology thrived as a form of dissent, resistance, pointing to a different understanding of what Christianity was about, where its allegiances lay with. And with the new civilian government, by the time we have a new civilian government, the Catholic Church decides it's the time to take a step back and let, the dynamics of participation, of, politics as normal to evolve without any kind of religious protagonism, as it had been the case when the church was, in many situations, laying its weight in defense of political prisoners, of social movements, minorities, and so on. So liberation theology is also being assaulted from outside Brazil, because since John Paul II became Pope, he decided to have a specific policy regarding liberation theology all across Latin America. And among other things, that meant replacing every retiring bishop, cardinal, priest with conservative ones that would undo any kind of work liberation theology priests and bishops had been able to put together until then. Well, in the Protestant field, we have the two new things that are emerging here are new evangelicalism in the American sense, holistic mission or integral mission theology, developing among a generation of young pastors, young lay people, and leading to an immediate connection of gospel preaching, gospel sharing, and social engagement. Because it also evolved at the same time as democratization is taking place. And churches are being challenged to say where they will stand, in relation to this waning, but still very powerful military regime, which needed replacing, needed changes, and only a wider alliance from civil society would be able to tip the balance and help political arrangements and negotiations at the top level to actually work their effect. Holistic mission then attracts a number of people from among university students, within seminaries, and in churches more broadly. But this is still a very small movement. Traditional evangelicals were the main target or the main breeding ground for holistic mission, the holistic mission movement, or what we also call in Brazil the Lausanne movement, after the 1974 Lausanne Congress or conference. The large thing that was really happening was a massive growth of Pentecostalism. Pentecostalism since the 50s was already over half of all Protestants in Brazil. But by now, we're in the mid-80s, early 90s, it's already nearly 60% or 60%, and soon it would be 2/3 of all Brazilian Protestants, where it still stands. Though there was a massive growth, we are talking here about 8% of the population, early 90s. Now, in 2023, we're talking about 1/3 of the population. Okay, So it keeps, the proportion is kept, but the numbers are just, mushrooming. And Pentecostalism brings with it a form of popular Protestantism, very low church Protestantism. Yeah. Many people coming from very humble backgrounds, many families without any children in higher education, people earning very basic, salaries, not enough to live decently, and so on and so forth. So Pentecostalism in Brazil grows among the poor, among the Black, has a majority of women, and so on. Well, within Pentecostalism, the other new thing emerging is neo-Pentecostalism. That's late 70s. I mentioned to you at the beginning that Edir Macedo found his universal church. There had been another kind of pioneering neo-Pentecostal church in Brazil, which had been founded by a Canadian missionary, Bishop McAllister. And out of Bishop McAllister's church, Edir Macedo came, and together with two other friends, a son-in-law and a brother-in-law and a friend. And today, each one of them leads a different church. Very powerful, each one of them, but the Universal Church is by far the most successful one. The two distinctive things about their church style is this discourse of spiritual warfare. That's we need to confront demons wherever they are, and they are not just in people's souls. Demons are also in culture. Demons are in politics, in the economics. So everywhere we can find them, we have to be able to confront them. And prosperity gospel, or the health and wealth gospel, which translates into don't wait for the state to do anything for you. You have to trust God. And if you trust God, you will have your victory. You will overcome. And one of the ways you can prove you trust God is you have to give. You have to give beyond your possibilities. You have to sacrifice. And God will honor your sacrifice. So that becomes something like a notion of speculative investment. So you invest money to get, out of that investment tenfold. And people donated their flats, cars, full monthly wages, and other things. Some of them never being able to recover that. Well, another dimension of this change, and which is also a combination of democratization and religion here, has to do with what I call minoritization. This is a concept which I draw from two different sources. Originally, it comes from two French intellectuals, philosophers, Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, and a political analysis based on their concept of minoritization was proposed by William Connolly, a political theorist from the US. Minoritization basically means it doesn't have to do with small numbers. It means that groups and identities that up to a certain point have been barred from view, invisible, discriminated against, persecuted, suddenly awaken and for different reasons, but taking opportunities that are created socially and politically. They want their voice to be heard. They want not to be represented by others, but being able to build their own representation in different aspects or at different dimensions of social life. So minoritization is about self-assertion of collectives of people, particular groups of people. We may be talking of Blacks, women, indigenous people, environmentalists, and here we must talk of evangelicals and Pentecostals, because by the mid-80s, they realize, and I'm going to, if time allows, I don't think it will, but I may kind of anticipate something here. They come to the view that they had grown large enough to remain unseen. They knew what the opportunities opened by the democratization process were, and they wanted to be part of that. They wanted to claim those opportunities for themselves. And then 1986 was this kind of a dividing moment or parting of the waters when national or general elections were called in Brazil. And part of that would lead to a constituent assembly that would discuss and revise all the authoritarian past and lay the ground for a new democratic society to be built. So Pentecostals, groups of Pentecostals, particularly people working in Congress as aides to senators and deputies, but were being members of Pentecostal churches, they decided that it was time to launch a campaign. The campaign was called Brother Votes for Brother. And it was cast this way. I can't apologize because it's not my language. It was Brother Votes for Brother, and only men were elected. They came from 2 representatives in Congress to 32 representatives at the end of this electoral campaign. And after that, it's a story of success. To the point that from aspirations of recognition, which had been in the minds of traditional Pentecostals, the Assemblies of God kind of Pentecostals, but also the Pentecostals from the divine healing kind of orientation, square gospel Pentecostals. You know, this could be thought of in terms of what I'm calling traditional Pentecostalism here, just to distinguish it from neo-Pentecostalism. Among neo-Pentecostals, there was a higher bid. They wanted to reverse the power the Catholic Church had in Brazil. And their political project was to topple the Catholic Church from calling the shots in religious politics in Brazil. So there were aspirations of reversal. And these 2 sets of aspirations will cross ways in many directions ever since, have crossed ways. Well, I'll have to go through this, not to spend too much time in preparing what you may be already expecting, which is what does all of that have to do with populism? I will be using populism here in a very technical sense. It doesn't define an ideology. It defines a form of politics, which can be found in many places and situations, including those we would hardly think of any populism. This is a new development in populism studies after decades of attempts to define populism, only to find out that there are so many varying characteristics that you can never pin down exactly what makes something populist. What turns someone into a populist leader? What makes us speak of a populist government? So some scholars came to a conclusion that we might be asking the questions, at the wrong side of a continuum. And what if we think of populism as something which happens when you have a very clear divide between the people and its enemies? The people here not meaning necessarily all the nationals in a particular society, but a political actor called the people, which names itself by naming its other, its irreconcilable other. And if we come to a situation like that, we will see that the people is not a homogeneous kind of entity. It is not pre-existing. It must be gathered through a series of interpolations, a series of summons from people who will try to stitch together all sorts of different grievances, needs, demands, wants in society, and construe them as being produced by that other. And we need to confront that other, we need to displace him, her, they, and then everyone will have their aspirations met. That's very much what populism always involves. This promise that something is wrong for so many of us because there's the few over there who are taking everything that should belong to us. And so we need to do something about that. It may be the politicians, it may be the elites, it may be an oligarchy, it may be a dictatorship, it may be a single person. So in a third place, populism would exist as a movement when, from among all this diversity of views, of demands, of grievances, or whatever we want to we may identify, a few or some of them are able to take on the representation of most others. So in that sense, sometimes it's around a particular concept or term, for instance, corruption. Who's against corruption is with us. And those who are not against corruption are with them. Sometimes it may be around questions of justice. Populism is not just a right-wing thing. So if you are in favor of justice for the poor, justice for women, justice for Black people, justice for the indigenous people, you are with us. We are the people. Sometimes it's international capital, the other, the 99 against the 1%. This is typically a populist logic. So that's what I have in mind when I mean populism. And that's where evangelicals have played a part in constructing the populist movement in Brazil. Let me tell you first one thing about this concept of public religion. How did Pentecostals in the end manage to emerge socially and politically in Brazil? By going public. They had been existing as denominations, churches, since 1910. By 1985, there were 2 Pentecostal representatives in Congress out of 9 or 10 representatives from Protestant churches. So the traditional Protestant churches were already a minority, but they were more successful electorally than the Pentecostals. Pentecostals then were not even named as Pentecostals. They were the believers. They were there was a very derogatory way of identifying them, especially in rural areas. They were the goats. And so there was lots of prejudice against Pentecostals as being too traditional, as keeping to rural forms of dressing and speaking, even though they lived in large urban environments, for being so reserved about moral issues, to the point that they would not have TVs home, so their children would not be, deformed in their upbringing by mass culture, consumerism, and things of the sort, but also the sexual appeals that were beginning to become easier to spot in television and so on. They would not attend football matches, which is a crime for Brazilians. How could they not attend a football match? Oh, that was a sin. They would not allow people their children to go to cinema. No films, no films. So that sort of culture, of course, would locate them as very backward thinking and oriented kind of people. But through going public, they not only transformed society's views about themselves, but they ended up being transformed themselves. And as time went by, their controversial views, because they had been debated and discussed publicly, began to be contested publicly, and not just by other Christians, also by non-Christians or by people who had no particular religious, definition in what they did. So public religion actually shows two faces. It allows for a particular minority group, such as Pentecostals, to emerge, be seen and heard. But on the other hand, it renders them vulnerable to contestation. Yeah, and dealing with contestation has become a very difficult thing for Pentecostals. Many times they resort to the discourse of persecution. We are a persecuted minority. Christians in Brazil are being persecuted, and Bolsonaro said something to that effect to the United Nations General Assembly a few years ago, that there was persecution against Christians in Brazil. It's a lie. There is no persecution of Christians in Brazil. But Christians, particularly very radical Pentecostals, do persecute Spiritists and Afro-Brazilian members, religious followers. That is a fact. But anyway, I don't want to sound too controversial here. Let me just move on. So public religion projects, catapults Pentecostals into the limelight of politics, culture, debates on economics and everything. At the same time, it subjects, or it opens their views on many other things, particularly moral issues, to public contestation. And people are not debating whether God is for abortion or not. They are debating that Pentecostals are but one view among Christians, and there are other Christians who have other views on abortion. Questions about, gender equality, questions having to do with care for creation or environmental concerns. So debates begin to regroup the very notion of Christianity into different positions and kind of push Pentecostalism and their allies into this particular kind of very conservative and criticizable lot. There are other kinds of contestation coming from movements that had until then benefited from this opening that the democratization process had allowed, and feminist movement, Black racial equality movement, indigenous movements, pro-environmental concerns movement, ecumenical groups calling for egalitarian understandings of religion, and all this diversity of groups and positions develop over time tensions with Pentecostals and their representatives. By the time we get to 2016, and I know that I have been very slow moving across time here, there's another moment which is a critical one, and it is after 13 years of a center-left coalition led by the Workers' Party, the largest left-wing party in Latin America, 2 terms in office by Lula, 1 term in office by his successor, Dilma Rousseff, the first female president of Brazil. In 2014, we have general elections. She is re-elected, but already under all sorts of challenges, And by 2015, the opposition in Congress develops the possibility to basically bring the government to a halt, bring the government to its knees by blocking anything which the government would send to Parliament for examination and approval, and by approving things which were completely against the grain of the government agenda. So growing tension develops between those in the opposition that were kind of losing nerve about losing elections one after another. And for reasons which I don't have the time to explain, corruption cases, allegations, but also proved cases within the government offer the possibility for a frontal assault on the government to be mounted, which is successful to the point that Dilma Rousseff comes to be impeached in 2016. And 2016 is also the year when the very last of Pentecostal groups still supporting this center-left coalition will have left it and joined a different, very different kind of political grouping, which will lead to Bolsonaro's victory in 2018. I see this following a little bit Derrida's reflections on 9/11 and some other crises in Europe and so on since the financial crisis of 2008. He talks about autoimmunity as a process through which democracy attacks itself, attacks its own defense. For instance, surrendering your legal rights or your freedoms so the government can have more power to fight terrorism. We heard about that from 1991 already, but very much so from 9/11. And as immigration in Europe is associated with the growth of the threat of terrorism, then again, you have all these calls from governmental people and from some other quarters in society and politics that democracy must be controlled or sometimes left a little bit aside so the real fight is fought, and after that we can come back to normal times. Well, that happened in Brazil because Rousseff was impeached for reasons that 48 hours after her impeachment were declared to be normal and legal. So 48 hours before, they were strong enough reasons to lead her to an impeachment. 48 hours later, publicly admitted those are no longer grounds for impeaching the president. So that's autoimmunity. Autoimmunity also in the sense that many other forms of democratic checks and balances were lowered in their operation. So a project of reconnection, but what I really mean here is the Latin word religare, which was used by the president who took over from Dilma Rousseff and said, I have a religious mission to fulfill in this country. And it is to do a reconnection of the people. The Brazilian society is divided, polarized, fragmented, and I consider it to be a call from God to produce this reunification. So religare is the religious motto of this first government after impeachment. And this is the first government which led to a larger number of Pentecostals in top positions in government. Some of them had already been during Lula's and Rousseff's years, but now there are more of them. They are there for the inauguration of the president. They surround the president. They pray for him. They commend Brazil to the lordship of Jesus in national television. So, and from then we begin to see a number of other changes which, through which religion takes more and more a kind of front page position in Brazilian political life. So until 2010, until 2016, really, I would say, we have a process whereby Pentecostals emerge first as a minority on their own, but over time they seek to become representative of the whole lot of Protestants in Brazil. After 2016, they claim they are now in a position to speak in the name of the Christian majority in the country. And the Christian majority for them is the name the new project should have of bringing together all the elements of spiritual warfare, prosperity gospel as a kind of economic platform, and now a very open confrontation of the left, between inverted commas, by which they mean anything having to do with equality, the gender, race, sexual agendas, anything having to do with what for them could represent hindrances or difficulties for the spread of evangelical Christianity in the country. More than that, they would identify the left with that political actor responsible for the values crisis the country, according to them, was going through, which had led to corruption, had led to all sorts of conflicts going on between people, within families, and so on. And they wanted to mend all that through a new coalition of forces, which brought together, and now openly, they presented themselves as right-wing people. They wanted to leave everything which had to do with the left and be able to speak as right-wingers for the conservative masses of Brazilian society. And then three moments are important to understand that. I'm coming to my final moments here. One of the elements is the need to connect the religious right. And by now, nearly 40 years, just over 40 years of experience in politics, Pentecostals and conservative evangelicals had developed enough expertise to go ecumenical about their negotiations, political negotiations. So they would not discriminate against Catholics, Jews, Spiritists, even atheists. They would not challenge people's dubious personal morality, provided that they would be in favor of nice, old, conservative family values, traditional values, and against what the left could represent. So Catholics could be able to fit in, and mainly the old Catholic right, which was very strong on judicial issues, litigation. They there's a very well-organized association of Catholic legal experts in Brazil, which was the basis for the creation of an association of Brazilian evangelical legal experts as well in the 2010, 12. Well, dominion theology among Pentecostals had become rampant, including among traditional Pentecostals. And the idea is God wants us to be wherever leadership can be exercised in the country. So one aspect of dominion theology is the seven mountains metaphor, that there are seven mountains that need to be conquered for God, and Christians are called to do that. So the mountain of government, the mountain of art and entertainment, the mountain of the economy, the mountain of, I can't recall all of the seven ones. But dominion theology and this seven mountain thinking became quite popular, taught in churches, Sunday schools, special courses for aspiring aspiring Christians in politics and so on. From traditional evangelical quarters comes Reconstructionism, this reinterpretation of Calvinism, Doivert, the Kuyper kind of understanding. Well, I'm mentioning these two names. I'm not necessarily providing an interpretation of their work, which I know is quite diverse and quite disputed. So the point here is just to say from this moment onwards, we have a new move from traditional Protestants, basically in Presbyterian and Baptist churches, to present themselves as champions for translating God's law into civil law, changing what the Bible says about how society should be organized, and particularly this has to do with understandings or readings of the Old Testament, and updating the language that is underlying those prescriptions, or at least their interpretation of Hebrew law and things of the sort, into contemporary public issues, political issues, and so on. Second movement is articulating this religious right to other groups within the right, various other rights, around questions of values. The racist right, it's interesting that suddenly questions of racial equality come to be under attack within churches in Brazil, because Blackness is associated in some of these discourses in a very twisted way to African legacies having to do with those religions in Brazil that represented the Black inheritance or the Black heritage of the former slaves. And today, two of them are still there, which are very, very small. We're talking about the two together gathering about 5% of the population, but they are seen as especially threatening and dangerous, because the devil himself or itself is part of what they do. So racism begins then to find its spaces of expression within churches based on this kind of twisted forms of argumentation or reasoning. Well, glorification of arms, under the argument that we have to be able to defend ourselves from criminals, all the way to this country needs to be prepared for what is coming, and there may be very bad things coming. So Bolsonaro used to say, an armed people is a free people. And as far as I am concerned, I would like every Brazilian to hold a gun in his home. And he almost reached that, because there was a growth around 65% in the number of arms circulating in Brazil in the last 6 years. Finally, I mentioned this general rallying cry against the left, which resonated with other social and political forces, not necessarily from the right or in the right, but wary of the Workers' Party, wary of what Lula represented, wary of what radical left politics could mean. So resonance brings some of these people to the fringe of a wider movement that portrays itself as the Christian majority. And the Christian majority represents, and I finish here, a form of understanding of democracy for which the majority doesn't have to give too much space or consideration for minorities. Minorities are tolerated. And if minorities want to trespass this limit and be very loud, noisy, or disruptive, democracy should be able to put them in their proper places. So this this means a very conservative and even authoritarian understanding of what democracy is. But that's how this wide range of right-wing politicians and activists understand their presence in public domain, their participation in elections, their leadership of organizations, their mobilization of people. We are here representing the people. If you do anything against that, beware. We are ready to act. So this is what populism, conservatism, and religion have had to do, have the ways in which they have connected over the last 15, 20 years. I had more things to say, but I'm going to stop here to allow for discussion. And of course, there are other stories. I only brought this part of the story. You may have questions to ask about those who remained non-conservative among evangelicals, pentecostals, and so on. But that's a different story. I'm able to and willing to talk about that, but today I'd like to focus on this trajectory and what it has meant politically for the country. Thank you.